but today we're going to discuss the origin of life and the modern cell. So, life, what is it? It is the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. So, the smallest functional unit of life is called the cell. So the cell is a membrane-bound structure that occurs as a functional independent unit of life, or as the structural or fundamental unit in a biological tissue specialized to perform a particular function in some organisms. So it's either the smallest form of life as its own independently, so unicellular, or the smallest form of life as a part of an organism composed of many cells, which we know is called multicellular. Okay, a little bit of background information. The Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Okay, and when it first formed, it was incredibly hot, and all the rock on the surface of the Earth was composed of toxic chemicals. Okay? About 3.8 billion years ago, meteors containing small amounts of water were pulled towards the Earth by its strong gravitational force. This continued to happen for about 20 million years. Eventually, the Earth accumulated enough water to the oceans. And then these oceans, because they're sitting on this incredibly hot rock that's made of toxic chemicals, the oceans become full of toxic chemicals. Also, at the very bottoms of the oceans, and some of these still exist today, if you look at the GIF in the bottom left, those are called hydrothermal vents. So from within the Earth itself, so beneath the crust, there are chemicals still being spewed out into the ocean. It's not as much today as it was, 4.6 billion years ago, 3.8 billion years ago. But that's essentially what those chemicals look like, spewing up into the ocean. And because the ocean isn't just water itself, it was water with all of these toxic chemicals in it, that is known as primordial soup, because it had more of a soup-like viscosity to it as opposed to just regular water. Now, life has existed on Earth for about 3.5 billion years. So it took about 300 million years of the Earth slowly cooling and chemical reactions occurring within the toxic-filled ocean or primordial soup for life to actually come into existence. If we look at the picture in the top left, we can see how that kind of happened. So there's little numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those were just the chemicals starting to form basically simple molecules with one another. Okay, very, very simple molecules. Then eventually those molecules, as again, the Earth was cooling, when in colder conditions you're able to make more stable reactions as opposed to hotter conditions. Basically, matter is like less sporadic in cold than heat. But again, those molecules become larger, more complex, and eventually you start to get molecular structures because of all these chemical interactions that are similar to that of DNA or RNA. Okay? And then those interactions start to take a little more shape, and eventually you get something like DNA. And as far as like a cell membrane goes, those would just be other kinds of interactions, other organelles, other kinds of interactions of these toxic chemicals basically forming molecular compounds. And eventually these compounds just became, a part of one another to make this functional, living, working thing that helps for survival. Now, that was very, very briefly summarized, so I'm going to put 2 links in the description of this video. One is just about how the universe came into existence and evolved, and then another link is going to be for a video about how the Earth specifically evolved and transformed over time. So be sure to check those out if you want more background information. Okay, so evolution and life differentiation. So once life existed, again, from all those interactions happening of chemicals and that primordial soup, eventually forming DNA and the cell membrane. Once life existed, the first cells were prokaryotes that reproduced asexually. So asexually, just splitting through mitosis. DNA is identical, but the only thing that makes this DNA not identical would be the occurrence of random mutations. So the actual process of like mitosis, if it happens perfectly, makes identical cells with identical DNA in them, but if a random mutation happens, then that DNA becomes different in some way. So again, most mutations tend to be negative, but the mutations that were positive or advantageous for survival in a particular environment, those remained. So over incredibly long periods of time, these cells acquire so many differences in mutation that they result in a different species. This continually happens over the course of 3.5 billion years, so really long period of time, to get the diversification of life seen today. All right, so what we call that diversification of life, we call that evolution. So evolution is the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified earlier forms during the history of the Earth. What is a species specifically? So it is a group of living organisms consisting of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding. The species is the principal natural taxonomic unit, ranking below a genus and denoted by a Latin binomial. We'll get into taxonomy in a later video, but basically species, it's its own group of living organisms. They breed with one another. That's like a real indicator that something is a different species. As far as like at the cellular level, basically they're just splitting into uniquely different cells from one another. That's really the indicator of the different species. So the first kind of split was obviously the first kind of cells, they're prokaryotes, so bacteria, very simple. And then one of the first kind of splits or diversification in this evolution, again, all these accumulation of mutations, would be archaea. So archaea are very similar to bacteria, but they're like bacteria that can live in extremely harsh conditions, on volcanoes, on glaciers. They only live and thrive actually in these extreme environments. Okay? So bacteria archaea, first to exist, and then another branching or splitting off of diversification is eukarya or eukaryotic cells. All right, so how do we get eukaryotes? Got them through the endosymbiont theory. That kind of explains how this happens. So here, in the picture on the left, we look at the very left kind of step in this. So an early eukaryote was parasitized by or ingested some aerobic prokaryotes. These cells were protected and produced energy for the eukaryote. So basically, there was this pre-eukaryote cell, which was basically a cell that was just larger than your typical prokaryotes. Okay? And so basically, these prokaryotes had a better chance of survival if they were within another membrane of protection. So basically, these smaller prokaryotes would literally merge with the larger pre-eukaryotes, because again, they're not eukaryote cells yet because they don't have all these organelles yet. But the prokaryotes basically lived inside the larger pre-eukaryote cell to have the protection, and then any extra food, nutrients, resources, energy that was produced by the prokaryotes living inside the pre-eukaryote cell got to basically feed off them. Now, over time, and many more changes later, the aerobic prokaryotes became mitochondria in all eukaryotic cells. So we know this because mitochondria actually have their own kind of unique DNA to them as well. But yeah, that's how mitochondria came into existence, is because they were literally prokaryotes absorbed by larger pre-eukaryotic cells to then eventually become just regular eukaryotes. Going over to the third step in the top right, so some eukaryotes also form symbiotic relationships with photosynthetic bacteria, which contain photosynthetic pigments. So basically, there are some prokaryotes that did photosynthesis, and those would eventually become chloroplasts. So now looking at the bottom half of this image, bottom left, over millions of years, the aerobic prokaryotes became mitochondria, no longer able to live on their own. And then for future plant cells, because again, plant cells are the only ones that have chloroplasts, the photosynthetic bacteria became chloroplasts and protists for plant cells. So endosymbiont theory is essentially, again, the larger pre-eukaryote absorbed smaller prokaryotes, and they worked so well together, it was so advantageous for each of their survival that they literally evolved to become their own unique species. And that is essentially how the modern eukaryotic cell came into existence. Thank you for watching. Please share and subscribe, and remember to spread kindness.